Hey guys, Mr. Mini Painter here and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be showing you how I painted the Dead Marsh Spectres from the Lord of the Rings Middle-earth strategy battle game by Games Workshop. That's a mouthful. I'm going to show you how I painted those guys with these deadly faces, but also how I made those marsh bases. Nice and swampy base. And I'm gonna paint all three of them, so I hope this video is of any help to you guys, and if it is, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you, and also consider subscribing to the channel, because that's basically the only reason I'm doing this. I'd love to hear from you guys. Also, I have a Patreon page, and I'd really appreciate it if you consider checking it out, and because I'm making a lot of different content there as well. So for now, let's get to painting. So let's get started on modeling these models. As you can see here, these metal figures, they kind of have this horizontal support sticking in the slot of the base, and as you can see, I glued it slightly elevated so that it's not completely in the base, it's floating above for like a couple of millimeters, which is just enough to create a muddy base below, because I want to have some swamp elements, some depth in there. So there is some space in between, as you can see here. I glued it together like this because it's hard to do it afterwards. So kind of find a way how to glue these parts together while still elevated. Next, I'm using Sterling mud or any kind of mud you have lying around and kind of dab it all around so that the feet actually touch the ground now. Now what I want to do is create a marsh. So I am covering the raised metal parts so it kind of blends in with the base, and I'm kind of creating a pool here, as you can see. So a slightly elevated side, so you have some depth in there. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to be adding some water later on. You can see this kind of tiny basin here which we can fill later on. So by creating a kind of dam on the sides and some depth in there, we can add some water or whatever you have to create that effect lying around. And before we do it, of course, we're going to be painting it. So for all of these three Dead Marsh models, the Spectres, I did a similar approach. Of course, some unique elements in there, and just make it random. Now let's get started on painting those Spectres. For the base layer of the skin, I'm using rust gray. I'm trying to stay close to the original box art, and of course you can approach this by using contrast paints as well. They work quite nicely, but I always like building up some layers. Now I'm working on all three models at the same time, but for this video you will mainly see this character for the skin, and afterwards I will show you how I painted all of the other elements on the other models as well. Next step in the skin is shading it with some Drakenhof Nightshade. This way you can get some nice depth in there, and you can really define where the highlights will be. Sometimes, especially with these older metal models, it's quite hard to see where the details go. Next, I'm painting in the eyes with some Palette Witch Flesh. Because we used the Drakenhof Nightshade before, you get some nice dark shaded parts in the eye sockets, and that way the white of the eyes really pops out. So make sure that some of that darker skin tone is still shown. Next highlight is Fenrisian Grey. Make sure that you use very little paint when highlighting, because you want to be very subtle and still have the dark showing through. And the fun thing is that when you take a little bit of paint and it's almost gone, you can kind of use your brush like a dry brush and blend those colors together. Secondly, what I do is when I have painted the outlines, I actually thin down my paint and go over it again. So making my paint like a wash and kind of blend those two colors, the darker and the brighter one, together. Make sure not to make it too bright because you want to have the shaded parts. And also make sure that the light hits where the light should hit. Next step, I'm mixing some palette witch flesh into the Fenrisian grey. I'm making some extreme highlights here. Focusing only on the cheekbones, the eyelids, the eyebrows, the fingers, etc. Next, with some Iron Jaws yellow, I thinned that down just a little bit. I'm painting in some yellow glaze over the eyes. They are dead. They are glowing, these eyes. I don't know why, but that's the way they are. So your final result is something like this. I painted the skin on all three of them. Now I'm going to show you how I painted all the details on the model. Starting with the orc, I think. Some dried bark mixed with some Abaddon black on all the cloth. There's a lot of cloth on this guy, there's not a lot of color. There's some straps here and there that are kind of hard to define what they belong to. Of course, there's the part of the shield, the thing he's holding. I'm mostly base coloring them the same and kind of differentiate afterwards, because the base is going to be dark for all those colors. Next base color we're going to be using is Iron Warriors for all the metal parts. Iron Warriors tends to be a little bit darker than Leadbelcher, but it's quite similar, so you can use any kind of metal paint you have lying around. I'm also painting the sword, the helmet, the shoulder piece, and all those metal parts that you see, the armor on his legs. And there's this part of metal on the shield as well. Next, with some dried bark, pure dried bark, I'm going over all these straps and basically every piece of cloth on this model and create some highlights. I'm focusing on the larger areas and of course the top where the light would hit the most, and leaving the shady parts as they are. Then with some Thondia brown, I'm painting the belt and the strap around his waist. Then I'm shading everything with Agrax Earthshade, kind of blending all those colors together, including the strap we painted before. Just go over all of it and get some nice color differentiation and some extra shading in there. And I'm doing the same with the metal parts with Nuln Oil. You can kind of slap that on here. Don't be too precise. It's supposed to be dark, maybe even rusty. Then with some snakebite leather, a contrast paint, I'm painting in all the wood parts of the shield. Now at this point it might seem very bright, and we're going to change that afterwards, but the beauty of this paint is that you immediately get some wood grain result by going over it maybe 2 times if you want to kind of darken it up. Next I'm going to be highlighting all of the previously painted parts. First dried bark and Baneblade brown for the cloth around his waist and the part on his arm here. Again, I'm going over most of the top part of the cloth and give it an edge highlight here and there. Then with some pure Baneblade brown, I'm repeating the process but decreasing the area that I paint to get a nice transition from dark to bright. Afterwards, you can thin down your paints and try and connect the different colors together by kind of wet blending it and give it a nice smooth transition. Next, with some Stormhost silver, I'm painting all the metal parts, and I'm kind of dabbing it on with a dry brush. Wiped off most of my paint, so it's more or less dry. You get this nice damaged, battle-worn, aged effect on metal. It's been beaten, it's been there for hundreds of years maybe. Kind of just stipple it on, give it an edge highlight here and there. Use a smaller brush for the tinier parts. And to give it an extreme edge highlight, I'm using a fine-tipped brush and just go over the sharper areas that I really want to define. And then all of these Dead Marsh Spectres, they have some vines and green climbing up their legs and shoulders or whatever, coming from up the marsh probably. I'm using Castellan Green as a base color. There is a lot of it on most of models. They have been walking around these marshes and dragging all this foliage around, and yeah, it's all over here. This guy has it on his shield, his legs, a bit on his sword as well. So I'm covering all those areas with a dark green base tone, and we're going to brighten that up as we go. We're going to do so in 3 separate layers, and I'm using the same technique on all 3 Dead Marsh Spectres. So once the initial layer is done, I'm using the Lorraine Forest to give it a highlight. Kind of covering about 70-80% of what we painted before, but leave those deepest parts dark, nice and dark green, so that we create an instant shade effect. And the rest, of course, we're going to be highlighting with this highlight color. And we're going to do so once more with Elysian Green. But this time focusing on smaller areas, so kind of the leaves, for example, or give it an edge highlight if you're able. Just use a fine-tipped brush and get some nice details in there. I painted the strap on the shield with Rhinox hide just to have a different color in there, because it's a lot of brown on this model, a lot of dark. Let's make it a little bit more interesting by using a different kind of brown. Next up is this guy. For his armor, we're going to use Retributor armor, as would have been the original color, because of course this is way too bright for a guy that's been walking around this for years. So we're going to dull it down, we're going to make it look very worn. But the base should be this. This guy is a remainder of the Lost Alliance elves, and I really love their armor, the way... well, actually, their entire suit is beautiful. This golden armor, large, long swords, give it a really nice elven look. But of course, this guy's been dead for a couple of years, so we have to tone that down just a little bit. For all the metal parts, so the chainmail, the sword, etc., we're going to use Leadbelcher. There's some chainmail dangling around his arm here. It's torn, but it's still there. And of course there's his sword. Now we're going to get to shading this model, and we're going to use Reichland Flesh Shade on the gold parts. Give it a warmer look, create some shades in there, and later we're going to dull it down. I'm using Null Oil on the metal parts, the silvery parts that is. And then the cloth below, I'm using Nightlord's Blue as a base color. And also this we're going to darken down, give some highlights as well, but he's been wearing this stuff for years, for hundreds of years, so it cannot be clean. Same goes for the cloak, we're going to dirty it up as well. Now, even though I primed the model in a gray tone, I am covering it with some Administratum Gray to give it an even undertone. Once I was done with that, I'm using Bealtan Green to cover all of those golden parts. And this way you kind of get the illusion of corrosion already. We're going to take it some steps further along the way. Don't go too heavy when using shades, just go over it twice if you don't think it's enough. Don't give it a thicker layer, because you're going to create puddles and it's going to be pure green, and that's not what you want when shading. Once this is dry, I'm using Agrax Earthshade to go over it again, to make it darker and dirtier. Then I'm painting the hair with Doomble Brown. I think he used to be blonde, but this is what you get when you walk in a marsh for years. I'm shading this with some Agrax Earthshade. Now make sure to let that dry before continuing on the highlight stage. And for that I'm using Scrag Brown. Pick out some strands of hair and focus on the top and front mainly. Next up, I'm using Soul Blight Grey, which is a shade, kind of a grayish shade, which I'm using on the cloak and the belt around his waist, to give it that first dirty look. Then for the bottom part, I'm using Agrax Earthshade to dirty it up, as he's been dragging this cloak on the floor on the marsh bottom for years, so I'm adding some filth and dirt here and there. And this shade color works perfectly for that. Next we're going to be highlighting the blue cloth with Nightlord's Blue and Thousand Suns Blue. I don't want that to be too bright, so I'm focusing on the top parts and the fronts of those folds. Next, with some pure Thousand Suns Blue, I'm giving it an extreme highlight, decreasing the area that I'm painting. And next it's time to make that armor look a bit more worn, and for that I'm using Canoptic Alloy. Now this is a beautiful paint that you can use in several ways. You can kind of give it an edge highlight as I'm doing here, but you can also use it with a dry brush or kind of stipple it on if you want to have it a bit more of a battered look or an even more worn look. It's basically up to you and your preference. I love to give these edge highlights as it gives it some sharpness. Then with some Thondia brown I'm painting the sword handle. Now this is an elven sword, so I'm guessing it hasn't really gotten much damage because they are so well made. I'm using some hashut copper on the top. And with some Baneblade brown, I'm painting in some fine lines diagonally on the sword handle here. The difficult part of painting these kind of lines is that they have to make sense, you know what I mean? When they go around, they should start and finish at a logical point. So you kind of have to keep turning this model around and add some lines that are really correct. Then I'm using Null Oil on the sword, just a tiny bit more, to create some shading in there. And some Canoptic alloy again on the top of the coppery part we painted before, just to give it some shine. And there's the plants again. Swamp plants, Castellan green. I'm going through this a little bit quicker than the previous one because, well, you know how this works now, right? So highlight will be Loren Forest, covering about 70–80% of the plants. And after which we're going to be going to the final highlight step, Elysian green, focusing only on the very tips, the leaves, the edges. Now we're going to be adding some plants and swamp material later on for when we're going to be basing this model or finishing the base, so it kind of has to blend together in the end. I'm edge highlighting the sharp parts of the sword with some Stormhost silver. And I'm using this technique where I kind of pull paint in the opposite direction of the edge of the sword to create some sharpness in there. And now we're moving on to the last of the 3 Dead Marsh Spectres. And he's this Numenorian, I guess, from the Lost Alliance who fought Sauron in the couple of thousand years ago. And also he is still walking the marshes in his original armor. So we're going to paint that and dull it down again as he's been walking about for many years. It should be showing. So I'm using lead belcher for all the metal parts on this body. It's got some chainmail, some needle, some lag protection, the helmet, the sword. I'm going to use Retributor armor on all the gold parts, which is now way too bright, so we're going to be doing something about that later on. But we're going to start by giving it its original look, as we did with the previous one. So some gold parts on the sword, on the helmet, and on this helmet we paint the wings as well as some edges around those flaps on its cheek. Then I'm using some Ushapti bone to paint the cloth part that is showing here. It's on both arms. One arm is still having some arm protection, some armor there, and the other one is just some cloth dangling around. Then with some dried bark I'm painting in the arm protection on this arm here. Some kind of leathery thing, so I'm approaching it in those colors. Next we're going to be painting the cloth on his lower body, and for that I'm using a contrast paint, Space Wolves Grey, as a base color. This looks kind of blue, which it is a little bit, but it dries up really nice. I'm using Storm Vermin fur on the cloak. It's also seen a couple of years, so this is a worn piece of cloth. And let's make that nice and dirty. Next is some Baneblade brown for the hair that is showing here. Now we're going to continue on the front of the model again by using Black Templar to go over the part that we painted before, to kind of get a blend of those two colors. But make sure that the first layer has fully dried before doing this. Thin down your Black Templar just a little bit so the color is kind of shining through and you get a beautiful result of a blackish armor. And we're doing the same on the cloak as well. Also thin down that paint, and actually the beauty of this contrast paints is when you go over that in a thinned version, is the previous layer, and that's why you painted it before, is kind of shining through as a natural highlight. Next I'm using some null oil on all the metal parts, and you can go quite heavy on this to create some shade, some darkness in there. Again, this is old, this is worn, and it should look the way. I'm shading the hair with some Agrax Earthshade. And I'm also adding some on the helmet to make it dirtier. The arm pad, and the cloth on his arms, and the lower part of the cloak to dirty it up. Next I'm using pure Storm Vermin fur to get back some of the original color of the cloak, but just on those very top part of the folds, and focusing mainly on the top part of the cloak, and gives it some edge highlight on the bottom. I'm repeating this process and decreasing the areas that I paint with some Dawnstone, just to get back some of that gray. As the years go by, colors fade, so what remains is gray. Next up, with some Baneblade brown, I'm picking out those edges of the armor once more. And if you want, you can create some scratches on the leathery part, the armor. Is that a word? Armor? I don't know. Anyway, I'm picking out the hair, some strands of hair with the same color as well, giving it back some of its original color and highlighting that. Just pick out those tiny pieces, not the entire hair, but that very top parts that will reflect the most light. And I'm repeating that process with some rock art flesh as an extreme highlight. You can go about it two ways, just follow the strain of hair, or kind of hold your brush sideways like I'm doing here, and use it like kind of a dry brush effect. Next up, Stormhost Silver for the metal parts. Pick out some tiny details on the chainmail. Don't overdo it because it's old, you want it to look old, but give it an edge highlight if you know what I mean. I'm doing the same with the sword. Don't give it a straight edge, but kind of stipple it on if you're able. And I'm using a dry brush to dull down all the gold parts on the helmet, which gives a very nice effect. It looks like it's worn. You can see that it used to be gold, but it's kind of it's been aged, you know what I mean? The color is fading. And we're back with the plants. There we are again, Castellan green on the plant as a base color. After which we're going to be using some Lorraine forest again, covering about 70-80% of the first base layer. And some Elysian green as a final highlight. And that's it for all 3 Dead Marsh Spectres, but now it's time for the base. Now, as I have shown you in the beginning of the video, I made some recessed part here on the front of the model to create some watery effect. And that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you how I did it for all 3. Now, I made a raised area here around the edges, so when I'm using some still water afterwards, that it's not going to run off. You can use epoxy or whatever you have, but first we have to make sure that the color is believable, and for a watercolor I want to have some darkness in the middle, and for that I'm using Incubi darkness to paint in a tiny puddle of water here. Now I still think it's a bit bright, but we're going to take care of that later on. You can thin it down just a little bit so that when you pull towards the edge of the dent, or whatever you call this, pool maybe, dent in the sterling mud, you get some transition from sand color to a blue color. Now I'm painting in the center with some Drakenhof Nightshade to give it an illusion of depth. On the edges I stayed clear of the edges mostly, so you get a transition from a very shallow puddle to a deeper puddle. It's still a puddle, this is not a lake, you know? It's a marsh, so it has some ponds of water here and there. I'm adding some green in there as well with some Athonian Camo Shade, and I'm focusing mainly on the edges for this part. You get this nice dirty water effect. I'm covering the base itself also with some of that green. Just because it's gonna be swampy, it gives it kind of a mossy effect, even before we're gonna add foliage or whatever you have lying around. Next is dry brushing it, and for that I'm using some Lorraine Forest to add some extra green to the bottom. So stick to the base here, stay clear of the water, but just on that sandy parts I want to add some greens. Not too much, so make sure that you wipe off most of your paint before doing so. Now it's time to add some green here and there. I have some parts of moss lying around. I'm using some tweezers to kind of put that where I want it, and I thought it'd be nice to put some in front because it also helps keeping the still water I'm going to be adding as the last part in its place. And you can kind of blend that all together, so the watery parts, the plants you have, because in a swamp everything is wet, right? So this is the end result for the first model. I got the second one here as well, and I'm adding some tufts here and there. This is looking really nice. I also added some plants in the puddle, so we're going to be covering them with water later on, so it looks like it's kind of growing out of the water. Now this is looking quite nice already. And here's the orc, which I also planted some plant in the middle. I'm going to be adding some plants in the back as well. Now I'm using this AK still water because it's easy to use, it gives a beautiful effect. It's like an epoxy, and it dries within about 12 hours, so that's beautiful. So you have to take your time because it usually takes 2 or 3 layers because it's going to be drying as well. For this I'm focusing only on the puddle I created, so the deeper part of this miniature. I'm adding this still water, kind of spreading it around a little bit, and for that I'm using this piece of equipment I have lying around. You can use the back of your brush if you have a small brush as well. Kind of spread it around because it can have a wet look all around. I'm kind of pushing it in the plants and making it, letting it dry. Now once this is dried, the volume is decreasing, so you might have to repeat this step 2 or maybe 3 times. And here's the final result for the Dead Marsh Spectres. Now this was an absolute delight to paint. They had been lying around for years, many years, as these are really classic models from the Lord of the Rings game. Now, thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was of any help to you guys, and if it was, please consider leaving a comment. I'd love to hear from you and maybe hear from your results as well. And also consider subscribing to my page and follow me on my Patreon pages. I'll be making a lot more different content than I am making on the YouTube channel. So for now, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in one of the next videos. Bye bye!